So today we continue our series about Before You Go, training for the mission of God. And the theme today is purify.
Over the ages, God has demanded purity as a prerequisite for entry to any form of mission. And we must be spiritually committed before we are actually and culturally engaged.
One of the biggest challenges of being a missionary is how to love the world without being lured by the world. Maybe everyone at your work or school is heavily engaged in the party scene, and you don't want to totally shun these people. Your goal is to influence them positively. At the same time, you don't want to get trapped by this crowd either and unknowingly become the very thing you are trying to change.
One of the unique things about working in a different context is trying to figure out what things are cultural, what things are things that you need to learn and ways that you need to adapt, and what are things that are non-negotiable, or what are the things that you can't compromise in order to still be effective in your ministry.
One thing that the people in Campinas really struggle with is the ability to find ways to break the law without really breaking the law. I know, you must be confused. I have lived in Brazil for 23 years, and I am still confused about this. Really, most Brazilians, and not only those who live in Campinas, follow this very simple and effective principle in life. If you can get away with it, just do it. Everybody else does it, so it is okay to do it. Dar jeitinho, they say. Literal translation, let's find a way.
My personal story begins in Cuba, where the government is against Christianity, and it is hard to be a Christian. But my older brother was a Christian and shared the gospel with me and later baptized me at the age of 12. Today my brother is an elder of the Church of Christ in Cuba and has planted 3 churches. He always gives me good advice on how to live in an unbelieving world. When I was 15, I formed a musical group of 3 people. Our trio became quite popular. On one occasion, a member in the group who was not a Christian encouraged me to drink beer and to have sexual relations with some girls. My conscience did not allow me to do it. How could I lead hymns in church and do such a thing? And then I remembered a sermon that my brother had preached from Psalms 24:3-4. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not trust in idol or swear by a false god. I told my band partner that he knew that I was Christian, and that I could not be involved in such. From that day, I personally had peace in my heart, and this band partner no longer tempted me. I found courage not to be like the world, and to maintain the purity that my God demands of me.
Maybe you find yourself trapped in a sinful behavior within your unique family culture, and you justify your behavior that you do this for the purposes of belonging. And maybe you have stopped witnessing for Christ because your national culture tells you, we don't want you to witness because everyone likes it cool. Remember the bottom line, Jesus told us to go and change the world. But we can't change the world unless we first change our hearts. And as we think about preparing this year, this is one of the most important subjects I feel like we should be able to tackle.
So I want to share with you this morning one of my favorite Bible stories about how to love the world without being lured by it. In the book of Daniel, we find a great example of people who are struggling with the very same type of issues that we struggle with. Open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 1.
It'll be interesting as we read a lot in Daniel chapter 1 about the preparation process that these guys go through. They were training for 3 years. 3 years. Now, I took intensive German for 9 months, and sometimes, let me tell you, it felt like 3 years. But I just want to say, as we're talking about this topic, as we're going through this series of being prepared, of preparing ourselves, don't rush. There's something that we can learn about this 3-year process that these guys went through. I mean, they took them that long to learn language and literature before they began their service with the king. So again, don't rush. As we are committing ourselves to be engaged in the culture, to be fully devoted, it's a first step in a process.
Look at Daniel chapter 1, beginning with verse 3.
It says, Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility.
Debían ser jóvenes apuestos y sin ningún defecto físico.
Handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace.
He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table.
Su preparación habría de durar 3 años, después de lo cual entrarían al servicio del rey. Entre estos jóvenes se encontraba Daniel, Ananías, Misael y Azarías, que eran de Judá.
The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel he gave the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Misha, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. Here we see God working through Daniel's obedience already. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food.
The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. They began working for a pagan king.
To receive a job like this, probably they were doing things like collecting taxes, recruiting for military, doing other things. But their day-to-day jobs were basically furthering the policies and procedures of the Babylonian government.
And even more, not only did they receive Babylonian names and education, they also became employees for the Babylonian government. These aren't just Israelite exiles. They're now Babylonian bureaucrats.
In other words, they are in the king, following and advancing the king's policies, doing what the king wants, the command of the king, advancing the king, the Babylonian king's policies and agendas. Look, this is what is happening here. What we find this guy when they are engaging their culture, something that we can learn from them.
We don't read of any assassination plots. We don't read of them trying to change the policies or procedures or going on strike and refusing to do their job.
And you know what is more interesting to me? God does not punish them for doing this.
In fact, we see the opposite in the fact that they are promoted and they are moving up the bureaucratic ladder, if you will, and they are doing things in a way that is receiving praise from their employers.
They were found to be men of integrity, and they were promoted within that culture.
Daniel had a personal commitment to God. This is what the book of Daniel teaches us about how to love the world without being lured by the world. And let me tell you this morning that we will do our best mission effort when we are deeply devoted to God.
Our best mission comes out of our deepest commitment.
Our best mission comes from our devotion.
Our best mission will come from our deepest devotion.
Right off the bat, we see Daniel and his friends and their devotion to God's Word concerning their diet. And we see how that is bringing about their best mission as they enter their service of Babylonia. They are engaged in the culture, but committed to obedience.
If we ended our study there, we could come to some off-base conclusions that no matter the context, where you find yourselves, you need to adopt the customs and traditions of those around you, no matter how sinful or pagan they might be.
But wait a minute. Let's continue with our text. Go back to verse 8 of chapter 1. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Daniel, in the middle of his education, in the middle of his training, decided he was going to draw the line. He knew where that line was, and he was not going to cross it. He knew that eating certain foods was not correct. He knew that eating the king's food would some way be a sign that he was accepting the king's lordship. He was going to immerse himself in this new culture, but he was not going to cross that line.
Do you think it's only Daniel? There is also another group of men. In Daniel chapter 3 verse 18, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego say, King, we are not going to bow down to worship your God. This is the king who has raised a statue, an idol, and he says, men who are under him, under his kingdom, men and female, all the living, they have to submit to the idol that is erected. But these people, 3 men, they say, the Bible calls them young men, they say, King, may you know, in chapter 3 verse 18, may you know, even if our God is not going to save us, be sure, before even you command us, we're not going to worship your idol in a foreign land. You know, they were working over there, they have their jobs over there, they have their livelihood over there, perhaps they have families over there, but they have told the king, we are not going to worship your God. In verse 17, they said, even if our God is not going to save us, we are not going to serve your God. They drew a line, they drew a demarcation that, hey, this is where my job ends, and this is where my commitment to my God begins.
When we first arrived in Brazil, our accountant was beside himself. He could not believe that we would not cheat on our taxes. Everyone does it, he said. You don't want to give a corrupt government your money. You don't have to pay all of this, he told us. We drew a line. We were not going to cross that line. When we were dealing with the church's documents, the city officials expected a bribe from the church in order to make things easier, in order to make things go faster. This is common in Brazil. Everyone does it. We drew a line. We did not bribe the city officials. Of course, this created difficulties and delays with our documents, but God blessed the church in Campinas. And God blesses those who are committed to Him. We have our documents now, a lot later than we expected, but we drew a line.
Sometimes I think today is actually more dangerous than back then, because it's the subtleties of culture is where we must distinguish ourselves. It's more dangerous because it is the subtle conversations, tweets, status updates, or even how we spend our time. Those are our idols for today.
And as we think about preparation this year, this is one of the most important subjects to tackle.
When it comes to our culture, sometimes we're tempted to draw in. We seclude ourselves because we don't like what's going on in the world and would rather pretend it's not there. So we draw in, or we blend in. We immerse ourselves so much with the culture we live in on the pretense of ministry. But the reality is, there is no difference between us and the sinful culture we inhabit. So we blend in. Daniel and his friends teach us to stand in. We put ourselves in the mainstream culture, but carry with us the uncompromising resolve to stand for the faith.
Wherever you are, there's a culture going on around you. And in order to be fully engaged in a way that we can help people and get people, and that people will see the relationship and the devotion that we have to God, we have to be somewhat engaged and participate in that culture. But we are not to the point where we are unable to separate what makes us God's people.
And Kenya is known as a world power in terms of athletics, in terms of marathon and mid-distance running. But when you talk to these athletes, they'll tell you one thing. They have the highest discipline in terms of their social life. They diminish their social life. They check on their diet, what they eat and what they don't eat. This is a form of a discipline that is going to enable them to compete in the highest level of athletics and competitions. And this is the kind of a practice of a commitment to their profession. And it's a requirement for a Christian. If you want to succeed in missions, purify. Have a personal and deepest commitment to your God.
So are you ready to give your best devotion, your best obedience? Today is the first step of a process. God only requires your devotion. He will do the rest. So what you have to ask yourself is, are you ready to take that first step? Now maybe you have taken that first step. Maybe your devotion is fully there. Your obedience is all there. Maybe you think, I have my obedience, I have my devotion, but I don't feel like I'm engaged in the culture. I'm going to church twice on Sundays. I'm there on Wednesday nights. I'm listening to Caleb on the radio. But I don't really think I can think of one non-believer friend or non-Christian or someone who doesn't go to church. Well, then you're not really engaged in the culture.
Some of you today, I know, are devoted to God, but have not yet seen the world as a field ripe for harvest.
Engaging the culture takes time, it takes work, and it's messy. Because people's lives are they're really messy. And that doesn't mean we become a mess along with them. It just means that we are there with them in that mess.
There's a strong relationship between the overall success of the message and the purity of the messenger.
It is then that we can truly shine as the light in the dark world and be the salt of the earth that will hopefully cause others to look to our Savior.
Your best mission effort will not come because of your talent, because of your skills, because of your abilities, or even because of your money.
Some Christians, or many of us, or some of you think like, if I want to succeed in mission work, I have to have some special gift, I have to have some money, I have to have some sponsorship, I have to have some special mental abilities or capabilities.
We can be the most brilliant people in the world, but if we're not morally pure, we will cause more harm than good.
Our best mission comes from our personal commitment to God, because He's the source of all our missions. He's the source of the message.
It will come from being pure in God's eyes.
The time, the effort, the work that it takes to be engaged in somebody's life, engaged in the culture, it's worth it. It's worth it for transformation.
So what do I do? What next? Maybe you need to be honest with a friend about some decisions you made in the past. You have realized they were not correct decisions scripturally. They were not in accordance with the scriptures. You need to go back and confess it wasn't the right decision you made in your life.
Maybe you need to let go of some friends. Maybe you need to get rid of some relationships because of the ways that which they're having a negative effect on you and causing you to kind of be ineffective in your mission or even in your devotion to God.
Maybe you need to invest in a mission project as we prepare this week to give. It is something that I would ask you to consider. If you are sensing God is speaking you to go in that area, something that I ask you to consider this morning.
Maybe it's that you need to spend more time with God, and you need to become more devoted to God in personal ways, whether it's through personal time with God, whatever it is that you might need to do.
Maybe you need to think seriously about what you're planning to give for the Mission Sunday. And you feel some voices telling you, wait a bit, this is too much, this is too low. I think this is an area also you need to consider. Friends, our deepest commitment to God amounts to success in mission work.
Whatever it is, I would encourage you to do that. I thank you so much for continuing to support missions around the world.
What can you do this week to increase your personal commitment to God?
It's my call this morning that we consider going to the world and change the world instead of the world changing us.
Give God your best devotion, your best obedience for His mission.
May God bless us all as we live a life of full devotion and commitment to Him.
God bless you, my brothers.
Thank you so much. God bless you all.